I still, by default, see things as a collaborative effort. Even though I might be doing something, I can't do that without all this other structure around me, because that's how, in my experience, creative work is done collaboratively, because that's how it works best.
So I think there's many different ways to do history. And I think that every department I've ever worked in, there's been an acknowledgement that we don't all do this the same way. And that, you know, there are varieties of different ways to do history. Perhaps people are a little sceptical of really anti-empiricist works, or anti kind of, you know, going too far down a postmodern track where, you know, what does truth mean to the kind of nth degree? But in general, I think that there's no one discourse of how to write history, and most departments that I've worked in have had a kind of series of complementary staff who do different things, and I think that's really important, actually, that we're not all the same and that we all do think about different things differently.
I don't think you can inhabit a discipline without learning ways of talking that go with it. And I think it creates a lot of problems within universities, because we want to be big entities in which we understand each other and which we can talk to each other. And I think a lot of the time, I mean, you know, when I've been on central committees representing the humanities on those committees, I've been very conscious of the fact that misunderstanding is readily available.
In terms of language, and I'd say research differences, I think this is most pronounced in my focus on the sociology of emotions and in the importance of emotions to research, and in the use of qualitative approaches. So in working with clinicians, say from a background in physiotherapy, I've done a lot of collaboration with colleagues from physiotherapy and medicine. The training, and there is, this is not just my experience, there is a lot of research to kind of bolster this point, but the training very much sees emotions as either irrelevant or suspect. So emotions might be a sign of kind of pathology. Emotions are often seen as something within that clinical socialization, as something that needs to be kind of suppressed, overcome, pushed to the side, whereas the sociology of emotions says emotions are everywhere. They are really important for our qualitative research. If a person has an embodied response, laughter, crying, these are responses that should direct the researcher to look further. This is a this is a point that requires further analysis. It's not something that should be seen as you know, biased or too emotional and put to the side, but this is the main focus. This is the main meal. So there can be, I think, big epistemological challenges, and even in using words like epistemological and ontological, I can recall a time when I was in not at UQ, but in another place of work, and was in a meeting. We were all talking about what should be required within the curriculum for honors. And I said, well, obviously we need to talk about epistemology. And the room looked at me like I had 3 heads, everyone in the room. So, what? So when you're working with colleagues who come from that dominant epistemological positioning of doing randomized controlled trials, thinking about the hierarchy of evidence, the questions about epistemology and ontology are not really engaged with. So that kind of philosophy of science language is a language that's foreign. And likewise, when I hear different language about anatomy and physiology, or different diagnoses, or especially acronyms of specific diagnoses, I need I need some help. What are you talking about here? So yes, certainly language differences from our own academic socializations can push us apart in terms of being able to understand what we're communicating, but that's also why we're coming together, because we do see things, we speak things in different ways, and we also see things in different ways.
I feel great tension between the different kinds of disciplines that come together. I think that there is a legacy of a disciplinary hierarchy, which while we hear more and more interest in interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches to addressing the kinds of challenges that we face, poverty, inequality, climate change, we know, we've increasingly come to understand within both the academy, within policy making settings and elsewhere, that we need to bring disciplines from different spaces together. But the practice is that we still see hierarchies with certain kinds of knowledges and claims to truth being reified above others. And that's certainly been my experience as a social scientist, that what we bring is vitally important in terms of understandings of the social world, of gender relations, of the way in which power relations play out in decision-making processes. If you want to affect change, you need to understand how decision-making processes take place. The kinds of perspective that the social sciences bring are really important in this space. But we have still, I think, a culture that says that the kind of Western reductive scientific knowledge is still particularly important in these spaces. So we have to be adaptable and flexible and willing to try and communicate across languages, really, across disciplines, but also across languages, to make sure that the kinds of perspectives we bring, which matter deeply, are understood by those that may have a very different training to us and speak quite a different language to us as well.
I was recently at some symposium or something like that, and I was on a table with a scientist, and we were discussing, I think there was a question up on the board asking about how we understand the assumption that's governing this I guess, argument that we're looking at, whether we believed in the assumption or we believed in the premise of something, of our subjective analysis. And the scientist chipped up and said, "I only deal in evidence, I don't deal in assumptions." And I think that was a really interesting moment where I didn't say what I should have said. I would argue that all evidence is based on assumptions. I think an interdisciplinary perspective on knowledge makes you interrogate it more deeply, because I think that one discipline's understanding of knowledge can never stand up under the scrutiny of another discipline's sort of apparatus of analysis, or analytical apparatus. And I think when you push your idea of knowledge through all these different analytical apparatuses from different disciplines, it changes and morphs and distorts and can become kind of wonderful and weird. And I think it's in those spaces that that you can really kind of discover something within that. And I think that's potentially more valuable than the thing within knowledge is more valuable perhaps than thinking that we've discovered it from the very outset, because then you wouldn't get to burrow down into all those different levels through all those different distortions of it.
Refugee arrivals, illegal immigrants were in these camps. They were sending letters to and from they were sending letters to advocates in Australia. So the way that I would analyse that is I would kind of look in the past and say, oh yeah, this is very interesting. This movement between the kind of people who are imprisoned and people who and their supporters actually has a long history, and we can trace that back to the 19th century when we first start seeing kind of literature, which is really sort of trying to present the voices of people who are oppressed, like whether that's in the form of kind of novels or posters or later on films, obviously, but that they're thinking about it. They tend to think about it more in terms of kind of deconstructing, like they're over in social and creative arts. They tend to think about it in sort of deconstructing, human, non-human relations, and several other types of frames that they're trying to use I was like, oh, I wouldn't use that frame. I would think about it in a very different way. But I still think we can talk to each other, because especially, I guess, because I have a bit of a background in more kind of like just out of interest, reading and engaging with lots of philosophical questions is in the sort of history that I write. I'm able to, there's a sense of a shared some sort of shared language that we can communicate on. And a lot of the time they are wanting to really engage with history. They're wanting to engage with the work of historians, and often they're reading historians as well.
So I do quite a lot of interdisciplinary work. I like collaborating with other people. I like doing my own work as well. But I think in the humanities, it's traditionally people did work on their own. Most people write books by themselves, and I like that. I like doing that kind of work because it gives you a lot of freedom. But I've also learned a huge amount by collaborating with colleagues. So I've edited about 3 or 4 books, and mostly those would be with other people, sometimes in my direct discipline, but sometimes in disciplines like Aboriginal studies. And writing with people across disciplines I find really interesting. So it just makes you think really carefully about what you take for granted and what's normal and natural in your discipline, which might not be normal and natural in a discipline that's not very far. It's not like I'm collaborating with people in veterinary science. But even I now work with quite a lot of historians, and I have an ARC grant, which is a group of fantastic women colonial historians plus me, and they think they're being very complimentary because they say, "Oh, you're really a historian, Anna," and they think they're being inclusive. But I always think, I don't feel like a historian. That's not my actual background. It's flattering that you think I can pass as a historian, but I find that my approach is just coming from somewhere slightly different in terms of its methodologies perhaps, but also what needs to be unpacked for me in a textual source is a little bit different from the way that a traditional historian might approach the same kind of source. And that's really interesting. Even something really simple like modernity. Modernity means, as a term in literary studies, is not quite the same as what a historian might mean, which is not quite the same as an intellectual historian might mean. And so, these are terms which you would kind of think would be taken for granted and that there would be a hard and fast definition of them. But you don't have to read very far or listen to too many conference papers to realise that those terms are having slightly different nuances, and sometimes quite radically different nuances in different disciplines. That was one of my disappointments in my undergraduate degree, was that I thought music and literature were actually very similar, and often the kind of period study that we were doing in music would totally have mapped onto the literary periods we were discussing, but there was very little discussion between those two fields during that time, which I found really frustrating because I could see how some of those ideas were being played out, not necessarily in exactly the same date range, but within a kind of an intellectual and social milieu, you could see these kinds of influences. But sometimes disciplines forget to talk to each other or forget to connect, and that's always, to me, a bit of a shame.
Look, I don't actually find it difficult to move between sub-disciplines and disciplines, and that's because essentially no matter what area you're working in, the methodology is still really the same. You're evaluating evidence, you're collecting data and evaluating it in the same kind of ways, right? What changes tends to be instead the standard literature that's available and the expectations of what kind of results you will produce, and the kind of audience for whom you produce the results. But to be perfectly honest, I find having the ability to work across different disciplines and sub-disciplines is actually really valuable because I do encounter a variety of different approaches, and that can be inspiring, infuriating, but also you can learn a lot. That's the other thing.